He lived alone and forgotten, until 5 Apache widows arrived crying at his ranch. Samuel Hart had lived alone for as long as he could remember. His ranch sat far from the nearest town, nestled between dry hills and wide-open plains. The land stretched endlessly, broken only by the occasional cactus, a lonely tree, or the winding path of a dusty creek. For many people, such a place would feel empty, even sad. But for Samuel, it was home. He had inherited the ranch from his father, who had inherited it from his own father, and each generation had left its mark on the land. Old fences leaned slightly, weathered barns held memories of better days, and the house itself carried the faint smell of wood smoke and dust. Samuel had no close neighbors. The nearest homestead was several miles away, and the road that led there was barely more than a trail. He rarely saw anyone except for the occasional traveler or a mail carrier who dropped off letters once a week. Most of the townsfolk in the nearby settlement had forgotten him existed. Sometimes he thought that might be just the way he wanted it. Life in solitude had a rhythm to it, a rhythm that Samuel had learned to appreciate over the years. Every morning, Samuel woke before the sun. He dressed in worn jeans and a faded shirt, laced up his sturdy boots, and stepped outside to greet the day. The air was crisp, smelling faintly of earth and sagebrush. He could hear the soft rustling of the wind through the grasses, the occasional crow calling from a distant tree, and the low, steady sound of his own heartbeat. These small, simple things were comforting to him. They reminded him that the world was alive, even if no one else was around to see it. Samuel's days were filled with routine. He tended to his animals, horses, cattle, and a few chickens that clucked insistently every morning. He mended fences, repaired barns, and kept the ranch in good shape. Each task, no matter how small, gave him a sense of purpose. He often worked from sunrise to sunset, the physical labor keeping his mind sharp and his body strong. Sometimes he would pause in the middle of a chore just to look at the horizon. The sun would rise in a burst of orange and pink, and the land would glow in the soft morning light. On those moments, Samuel felt a quiet connection to something greater than himself, a reminder that life, even in isolation, was full of beauty. At night, the ranch became even quieter. The wind would whisper through the trees, and the stars would spread across the sky in a dazzling display. Samuel would sit by the fire in his small living room, sipping on a cup of coffee or warm tea, thinking about the past. Memories would come to him, his parents, his younger sister, long-lost friends. Sometimes the memories were pleasant, bringing a smile to his face. Other times they were tinged with sadness, reminders of people who had left his life long ago. But even in the sadness, there was comfort. He knew that those memories were part of him, part of the story that had shaped who he was. Samuel had learned to find joy in small things. A well-fed horse, a patch of wildflowers by the creek, the sound of rain hitting the roof, these were moments that made life meaningful. He took pride in the land he cared for and the animals that depended on him. He did not need much else. People often asked him why he stayed so far from civilization, why he chose a life of loneliness. But Samuel never had a clear answer. He only knew that this was where he belonged, and he had no desire to change it. Despite his contentment, there were times when Samuel felt the weight of solitude more heavily. On some evenings, the silence of the ranch could feel overwhelming. He would walk through the fields, calling out to no one in particular, just to hear a human voice in response. Sometimes he would imagine conversations with his parents, asking them for advice or sharing a joke. Other times, he would read old letters or journals, reconnecting with memories that felt almost like visits from the past. These rituals helped him feel less alone, even if they could not replace the presence of real people. Samuel's neighbors, though distant, were kind when he saw them. They occasionally brought news from the town, small gifts, or even fresh bread. But these visits were rare, and Samuel often found himself returning to his solitude with a mixture of relief and melancholy. He had grown used to the rhythm of his life: work, care for the animals, tend the land, remember the past, and rest by the fire. It was a simple life, but it was honest, and Samuel found comfort in its predictability. In the evenings, as the sky turned deep purple and the first stars appeared, Samuel sometimes reflected on how much the world had changed. When he was young, the town had been busier, the roads more traveled, and the ranch more connected to the community. Over the years, people had moved away, towns had shrunk, and the land had grown quieter. Samuel felt a mix of pride and sorrow. He had remained, keeping the ranch alive while others left, but he also felt the sting of being forgotten. There was a certain loneliness in being the last keeper of something so old and precious. Yet Samuel did not complain. He had learned to accept life as it was, finding peace in the routine and in the land that had been in his family for generations. He knew that loneliness was part of life, but it did not define him. He found strength in self-reliance and joy in the small, daily victories: repairing a broken fence, helping a sick animal, or witnessing the first blooms of spring. Each day was an opportunity to connect, not with people but with the world around him. One chilly morning, as Samuel carried buckets of water to the animals, he noticed a flicker of movement at the edge of the ranch. It was brief and fleeting, almost like a shadow. He paused, squinting against the rising sun. For a moment, he felt a strange sensation, a mix of curiosity and unease. He shook his head and returned to his work, telling himself it was probably just a deer or a stray bird. But deep down, Samuel felt that something was about to change, something that would disrupt the quiet life he had built for himself. As the day wore on, Samuel continued his chores, unaware that the events unfolding that evening would bring a new rhythm to his life. The ranch, once silent and solitary, was about to witness a moment that would break the years of isolation. Samuel's story, which had been defined by solitude and routine, was about to take a turn that he could never have imagined. And though he did not know it yet, this change would bring life, hope, and unexpected connection to the lonely rancher who had long believed that he was forgotten by the world. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the fields, Samuel felt a mixture of anticipation and unease. Something in the wind seemed different, carrying with it a sense of approaching change. He closed the barn doors, fed the last of the animals, and settled near the fire, feeling a quiet tension in the air. The ranch, his constant companion for decades, seemed to hold its breath alongside him. Samuel knew that life on the plains was unpredictable, but he could not have guessed that tonight would mark the beginning of a story that would forever alter the rhythm of his solitary existence. That evening, as Samuel Hart sat by the fire, the quiet of his ranch was broken by a sound he had not heard in years, a soft, sorrowful cry carried by the wind. It was distant at first, like the moaning of the earth itself, but gradually it grew louder, closer. Samuel's eyes narrowed as he scanned the horizon. He could see nothing but the rolling plains and the faint outline of the hills against the twilight sky. The sound was human, unmistakably so. His heart quickened, a strange mixture of curiosity and apprehension stirring within him. Cautiously, Samuel stepped outside, the chill of the evening air biting at his skin. He walked down the path that led toward the sound, his boots crunching against the dry soil. The cries were clearer now, and with each step, he realized they were not a single voice but several, overlapping in sorrow and despair. Finally, as he reached a small rise near the edge of his property, he saw them. 5 women standing together, their faces streaked with tears, their hands clutching each other for support. They were Apache widows, he realized almost immediately. Their traditional clothing, though worn and dusty, spoke of their heritage, and their eyes carried the weight of loss and hardship. For a moment, Samuel simply watched. He had lived alone for decades, and the sudden appearance of strangers unsettled him. Yet he could not turn away. Compassion stirred in him, stronger than any fear of intrusion. Slowly he approached them, hands raised slightly to show he meant no harm. "Are you lost?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse in conversation. One of the women stepped forward. She was the eldest, her hair streaked with silver and her eyes were deep pools of sorrow. "We have nowhere to go," she said softly, her voice trembling. "Our village, it was burned, families gone. We have no home." Her words struck Samuel with the force of reality. These women were not wanderers by choice, they were fleeing tragedy. The grief in their voices was raw and unshielded, yet there was also courage, a quiet strength that demanded respect. Samuel paused, unsure what to do. He had lived a life of solitude and the intrusion of strangers was foreign to him. Yet he could not leave them standing in the cold, exposed to the dangers of the plains at night. Slowly, he nodded. "You can come to the ranch," he said. His voice was rough but firm. The women looked at each other, relief softening their tears for a moment before they began to move. The journey to the ranch was slow. The women were weary from travel and grief, their movements careful and deliberate. Samuel walked beside them, offering support where he could. He noticed the small signs of hardship, bare feet bruised and dusty, clothes tattered, eyes haunted. Despite this, there was dignity in the way they carried themselves. They did not beg or plead. They simply asked for shelter, a place to rest. When they arrived at the ranch, Samuel led them inside the house. The interior was simple but clean, warmed by the fire that had been burning all evening. He showed them the few spare blankets and told them to rest while he prepared food. The women moved cautiously, unsure of what to expect from the quiet man who had opened his doors to them. They settled near the fire, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames, and for the first time in days, they seemed to relax slightly. Samuel busied himself in the kitchen, preparing a simple meal of stew and bread. The smells of cooking filled the room, and for a moment the women allowed themselves to hope. They shared quiet conversations in low voices, speaking of their lost families, the dangers they had faced, and the journey that had brought them here. Samuel listened from a distance, absorbing their stories without interruption. He did not offer judgment or advice. He simply allowed them to speak, recognizing the power of being heard. As they ate, Samuel noticed the bond beginning to form among the women. Despite their sorrow, they shared small gestures of care, passing a plate, offering a gentle smile, brushing a lock of hair from a tired face. Samuel had lived alone for so long that he had almost forgotten how human connection felt. Watching these women, he felt something stir inside him, something he had not felt in decades, a sense of belonging, even if it was still fragile and uncertain. The night grew late, and Samuel guided the women to the spare rooms. Each room was modest, but it offered warmth and safety, a stark contrast to the hardships they had endured. He did not force conversation, understanding that grief needed space. Yet before he left, he offered a simple promise: "You're safe here. For as long as you need, you can stay." The women nodded, gratitude and relief shining in their eyes, though it was mingled with the ever-present sadness of loss. In the days that followed, Samuel's routine was disrupted in ways he had not anticipated. The women began to settle into the ranch slowly. They helped with chores, tended to the animals, and prepared meals alongside him. Samuel, though initially hesitant, found himself appreciating the presence of others. Their laughter, soft as it was, began to fill the empty spaces of the ranch. Their stories, shared by the fire in the evenings, brought color and life back to the quiet house. Samuel realized that while he had been content with solitude, companionship could offer a deeper, richer sense of purpose. Trust, however, did not come easily. The widows had suffered great loss and their grief was raw. They were cautious, protective of one another, and wary of the world. Samuel understood this. He did not press them to talk or to share more than they were ready to give. Instead, he offered small gestures of care, a warm meal, a repaired fence, a hand extended to steady someone on uneven ground. Slowly, these gestures began to build trust, layer by layer. One afternoon, as Samuel worked on the barn, he noticed one of the younger widows watching him from the porch. She had a quiet strength in her eyes, a spark of curiosity beneath the sadness. Samuel paused, wiping sweat from his brow, and nodded at her. She returned the gesture with a small smile, and in that simple exchange, a connection was made. It was fragile and tentative, but it was there. The presence of the widows also forced Samuel to confront his own emotions. He had spent decades avoiding attachments, fearing loss and disappointment. Yet, watching these women navigate grief with resilience, he felt a mixture of admiration and empathy. He realized that isolation had protected him from pain, but had also kept him from experiencing the fullness of life, the joys, the connections, the shared moments of sorrow and celebration. Evenings at the ranch took on a new rhythm. The fire became a gathering place where stories were exchanged, songs were sung softly, and memories were honored. Samuel, though initially quiet, began to share pieces of his own past, tales of his family, the ranch, and the land. The women listened attentively, offering nods and smiles, validating the experiences he had kept to himself for so long. In turn, they shared their own stories, weaving a tapestry of life that connected the past to the present. Outside, the ranch began to change as well. The animals responded to the presence of the widows, softer and more playful than before. The house seemed warmer, more alive, as if the very walls were absorbing the laughter and conversation. Samuel noticed small details that had previously gone unseen. The way sunlight fell through the windows, the sound of wind through the trees, the subtle sense of cooking and drying herbs. Life, he realized, was not just about survival, it was about presence, awareness, and connection. Despite the progress, challenges remained. Each widow carried scars, both visible and invisible, that required patience and understanding. Conflicts occasionally arose, misunderstandings born of fear or fatigue. Samuel, for all his years of solitude, found himself learning new skills, listening without judgment, mediating disputes, and offering comfort without words. It was demanding, but also deeply rewarding. He discovered that the capacity for care, for empathy, did not diminish with age. It grew, nurtured by experience and compassion. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of red and gold, Samuel and the widows sat together on the porch. The air was warm, carrying the scent of sage and earth. They spoke quietly of their hopes for the future, of dreams long delayed by tragedy. Samuel realized that in these simple conversations, a profound healing was taking place. The widows were beginning to reclaim their lives, piece by piece, and he was rediscovering a world he had thought lost to him forever. By the end of the week, the ranch had become a place of refuge, a sanctuary not only for the widows but for Samuel himself. He had opened his doors to strangers, and in doing so, had opened his heart. The isolation that had defined his life was giving way to connection, compassion, and shared resilience. The ranch, once quiet and lonely, now resonated with life, laughter, and the soft murmur of healing voices. Samuel Hart knew that this was only the beginning. The presence of the 5 Apache widows had changed everything. The journey ahead would not be easy, for grief does not disappear overnight, and trust must be nurtured daily. Yet, in that moment, as the stars began to twinkle above the plains and the fire cast its warm glow, Samuel felt something he had not felt in decades: hope. A hope that life, even after loss, could be full of connection, purpose, and unexpected beauty. And for the first time in many years, Samuel believed that he was not entirely forgotten, that the world could still surprise him with its grace, and that even in the quietest corners, human lives could intersect in ways that brought light to the darkest of places. Life on the ranch slowly began to take on a new rhythm. The presence of the 5 Apache widows, once strangers, had shifted the quiet routine Samuel Hart had followed for decades. The ranch, which had been silent and solitary, now carried a subtle hum of activity, the clatter of dishes, the soft chatter of women sharing small stories, the gentle thrum of caring hands tending to animals. At first, the change was almost overwhelming for Samuel. He had grown used to working alone, to the comfort of silence, and suddenly there were voices, movements, and emotions filling spaces that had long been empty. Samuel approached this change cautiously. He knew he could not rush the women or force them into his way of life. Each of them had endured great loss and their grief was still raw. Yet he also recognized that they had courage, resilience, and a will to survive. He decided to meet them halfway, offering support where needed, providing guidance when asked, and allowing them to take their own time in adjusting to life on the ranch. Slowly, boundaries were established. Samuel respected their space, and in turn, they began to trust him. The mornings began early, as they always had, but now Samuel did not wake to emptiness. The women moved about quietly, preparing breakfast, feeding chickens, and tending small gardens that had begun to take root around the house. Their presence was subtle at first, one humming softly while working, another arranging herbs to dry, the third gently brushing a horse's coat. Samuel observed them with a mixture of admiration and curiosity. He saw the care they poured into even small tasks, and it reminded him of his own devotion to the land and animals. There was a shared understanding, a quiet respect born from the knowledge that both he and these women had survived hardship. As the days went by, Samuel and the widows began to work together in ways that were both practical and deeply symbolic. One afternoon, Samuel noticed that a section of the fence surrounding the pasture had weakened, sagging dangerously. He called out to the women, asking if they could help. At first, they hesitated, unsure of how to contribute to a task so physically demanding. But slowly, they joined him. Hands that had once held family and home now worked to secure the land itself. Nails were hammered, boards were lifted, and together they restored a part of the ranch that had been falling into neglect. The work was tiring, yet it fostered a sense of accomplishment that brought smiles and quiet laughter. Trust continued to grow in small, everyday ways. One morning, while Samuel was milking the cows, one of the widows approached him hesitantly. She had been silent for days, still carrying the weight of her grief. Samuel offered her a gentle nod, inviting her to speak if she wished. Slowly she told him about her family, the home she had lost, and the memories that haunted her dreams. Samuel listened, nodding quietly, never interrupting or offering unsolicited advice. In this simple act of listening, a profound connection formed. The woman realized she was not alone in her sorrow, and Samuel discovered that sharing stories could ease the heaviness that had long burdened him. The evenings became a sacred time for connection. By the fire, the women would share stories from their past, tales of family, traditions, and experiences that had shaped them. Samuel, in turn, began to recount his own memories, of parents long gone, of childhood adventures on the plains, of the challenges and triumphs of maintaining the ranch. Sometimes the stories brought laughter, a shared joke, a remembered mishap with a stubborn horse, the amusing antics of animals. At other times, tears were shed, grief honored, and loss acknowledged. Yet, through these moments, bonds were strengthened and trust deepened. Cooking became a collaborative effort. The widows introduced Samuel to traditional Apache recipes, simple yet rich in flavor, using ingredients that the land provided. Together, they gathered herbs, tended small vegetable plots, and prepared meals that filled the house with comforting aromas. Samuel, who had once eaten simple, solitary meals, now experienced the joy of sharing food with others. They laughed over spilled flour, exchanged tips, and discovered the pleasure of teamwork. It was in these ordinary moments that the foundation of a family began to take shape. Even the animals seemed to sense the change. Horses that had been wary of Samuel's solitude now approached the widows with trust, nuzzling their hands and accepting gentle strokes. Chickens clucked happily as they were fed, and the occasional calf followed the women as they moved about the fields. Samuel watched these interactions with quiet satisfaction. The ranch was no longer a place of mere survival. It had become a home where care, connection, and life itself flourished. Of course, challenges arose. The women's grief was not linear, and moments of tension and sorrow occasionally disrupted the calm. One afternoon, two of the widows argued over chores, voices raised in frustration. Samuel intervened carefully, not to reprimand, but to guide them toward understanding. He suggested that they work together rather than in isolation, highlighting the strength that came from collaboration. Slowly, the argument dissolved into apologies and gentle smiles, and Samuel realized that conflict, when approached with patience and respect, could become an opportunity for growth rather than division. Over time, the widows began to take initiative, contributing in ways Samuel had never expected. One woman started a small garden near the house, planting vegetables and herbs that would later nourish them all. Another began crafting simple blankets and rugs, bringing color and warmth to the otherwise plain interior. Their creativity and care transformed the ranch, not just physically but emotionally, as every corner of the house and yard carried the mark of shared effort and mutual respect. Samuel marveled at how quickly these women, strangers only weeks ago, had become integral to the rhythm of daily life. Evenings continued to be a time for reflection and shared stories. Around the fire, the widows began to share not only memories of loss but also hopes for the future. They spoke of dreams once deferred, of aspirations for new beginnings, and of the small joys they still sought in life. Samuel listened with a sense of awe. Despite everything they had endured, they had not lost their ability to hope. Their resilience inspired him, reminding him that even in solitude, life could surprise with beauty, connection, and unexpected growth. Samuel also began to notice changes in himself. The quiet man who had once relied solely on routine and self-reliance was learning to embrace vulnerability, to share emotions he had long buried, and to accept support from others. He discovered the value of patience, empathy, and humility. The ranch, which had always been a symbol of endurance and perseverance, now became a symbol of transformation, teaching him that life's richest experiences often came through connection, collaboration, and compassion. One evening, a gentle rain began to fall, the sound soothing against the roof and windows. Samuel and the widows gathered inside, listening to the rhythm of the storm. They shared stories, recipes, and quiet laughter, each voice contributing to a harmony that had been absent from the ranch for decades. Samuel realized that this shared space, filled with warmth, care, and mutual respect, was becoming a true home. The women were no longer strangers, and he was no longer alone. Together, they had begun to create a community built on trust, healing, and shared purpose. The days continued to pass in this way, a delicate balance of work, care, reflection, and connection. The ranch transformed under their collective effort, both physically and emotionally. Fences were repaired, gardens flourished, animals thrived, and the house became a welcoming space full of warmth and life. Samuel watched these changes with quiet pride, recognizing that the greatest strength of the ranch was no longer in its land or buildings, but in the bonds that had formed between people who had once been strangers. Samuel also discovered the quiet joy of mentoring and teaching. The widows, eager to learn from his experience, asked questions about animal care, farming, and the land itself. He shared knowledge patiently, demonstrating techniques, explaining routines, and allowing them to practice. In turn, he learned from them. Their knowledge of traditional remedies, crafting, and resourcefulness added depth to his own understanding. This exchange of skills and wisdom strengthened their bond, creating a sense of interdependence that was both practical and deeply meaningful. One afternoon, while repairing a section of the barn, Samuel paused to observe the widows tending the garden. He felt a deep sense of gratitude and wonder. In the midst of tragedy, they had found each other, and he had found them. Together, they were creating a life that was richer, fuller, and more meaningful than any he had imagined during decades of solitude. He realized that trust, once fragile and tentative, had blossomed into something resilient, a foundation upon which new beginnings could be built. As the sun set, painting the sky in hues of orange, pink, and gold, Samuel felt a profound sense of peace. The ranch, once silent and lonely, now resonated with life, care, and connection. The widows had not only found safety, but had brought vitality to a place that had long seemed frozen in time. Samuel knew that the journey ahead would continue to hold challenges, but he also understood that together, they could face whatever came their way. The bonds of trust, forged through shared effort, patience, and compassion, had created a new family, one that would endure and thrive despite the hardships of the past. In this way, the lonely rancher and the 5 Apache widows began to heal, each finding strength in the other. The ranch, once a symbol of isolation, had become a place of hope, resilience, and transformation. Samuel Hart, who had long believed he was forgotten, realized that life had a way of bringing people together when they needed each other most. The journey of building trust while challenging had opened doors to a new way of living, one filled with connection, purpose, and the quiet joy of shared existence. And so, life continued on the ranch, each day a testament to the power of trust, compassion, and the human spirit. The widows and Samuel, once strangers, had begun to weave a story together, one that celebrated resilience, the beauty of small acts of care, and the profound truth that even in the most unexpected places, human connection could flourish. Over the weeks that followed, life on the ranch grew even richer, fuller, and more meaningful. The 5 Apache widows, once cautious and hesitant, began to feel a sense of safety and belonging. Their grief, while still present, softened in the warmth of companionship and shared purpose. Samuel Hart, too, felt a transformation within himself. The quiet loneliness that had defined his life for decades gradually gave way to the comfort of connection, the joy of shared work, and the deep satisfaction of watching others heal alongside him. Mornings on the ranch became lively in a way Samuel had never experienced. The widows rose with the sun, their routines now intertwined with his. Some tended the animals, feeding the horses and cows, while others gathered water from the creek or carried baskets of vegetables from the small gardens that had begun to flourish. Samuel, though initially reserved, now found himself speaking and laughing more than he had in years. He noticed how small gestures, passing a tool, offering a hand, sharing a smile, could strengthen bonds and bring joy to even the simplest tasks. One morning, Samuel noticed that the youngest widow, a woman named Leela, had been quiet and withdrawn. She sat by the fence, watching the horses graze, her eyes distant. Samuel approached her slowly, careful not to startle her. "Are you all right?" he asked gently. Leela hesitated, then shook her head. Tears welled in her eyes as she spoke of her family, taken too soon, and the loneliness that had followed her across miles of land. Samuel listened patiently, his presence a steady comfort. He said nothing at first, allowing her words to flow freely. Finally, he placed a hand on her shoulder, offering reassurance. "You're not alone here," he said softly. "We're here with you and we'll face this together." Leela nodded, a small smile breaking through her tears, and for the first time in days, she seemed lighter. The widows, too, began to care for one another in ways that brought warmth and healing. They shared stories, recipes, and traditions from their past, weaving threads of culture and memory into the fabric of daily life on the ranch. One afternoon, they gathered herbs from the surrounding plains, crushing and drying them for teas and remedies. They laughed as they worked, teaching Samuel the names and uses of each plant. In these moments, the women felt empowered, finding purpose in caring for themselves, each other, and the land around them. Samuel, who had relied on routine and physical labor to define his days, realized that emotional care could be just as vital as tending to the animals or repairing fences. Meals became celebrations of connection. The women prepared dishes together, often inviting Samuel to join in learning new techniques. He discovered the joy of shared cooking, the satisfaction of creating nourishment for more than just himself. They talked as they worked, sharing memories of happier times, of family celebrations, and of small joys that had once seemed lost. Samuel noticed that the laughter, soft and gentle at first, grew louder, more confident, until it filled the entire house. The walls that had once echoed only with his own voice now carried stories, songs, and the comforting sounds of companionship. The widows also brought color and creativity to the ranch. One of them, Marissa, began to weave simple rugs and blankets, using colors and patterns inspired by her heritage. She taught Samuel to appreciate the beauty in small details, the way colors could tell stories, the way patterns could carry meaning. Another widow, Selena, started organizing the garden, planting flowers alongside vegetables, creating a space that was both useful and beautiful. Samuel marveled at how much life and energy these women brought to the land. The ranch, once a quiet, utilitarian space, had become a home filled with care, creativity, and love. As the seasons changed, so too did the hearts of those living on the ranch. The widows began to smile more freely, to laugh without reservation, and to find moments of joy even amidst memories of loss. They sang together in the evenings, voices blending with the sounds of the wind and the animals. Samuel, once distant and reserved, joined in occasionally, his deep voice adding a new note to their shared harmony. In these moments, the pain of the past felt lighter, tempered by the comfort of friendship and shared resilience. Trust continued to grow in deeper ways. The widows shared stories of the hardships they had faced, speaking openly about the fears, doubts, and sorrows that had followed them. Samuel responded with empathy, offering guidance when asked and silent support when words were not needed. Slowly, the barriers that had separated them began to dissolve, replaced by understanding and mutual respect. Each day, small acts, helping with a heavy load, preparing a meal, tending to an animal, reinforced the sense that they were a family, bound not by blood but by care, trust, and shared experiences. The ranch itself seemed to respond to this transformation. Animals grew healthier and more lively, the gardens flourished, and even the house, warmed by laughter and shared effort, felt more alive. Samuel observed the subtle changes with quiet satisfaction. Life, he realized, was not only about survival or routine. It was about creating spaces where growth, healing, and connection could thrive. The widows had brought this vitality, reminding him that even in the harshest of landscapes, life could bloom when nurtured with care and compassion. One day, a neighboring rancher visited unexpectedly. Samuel had not seen many outsiders since the widows arrived, and he was curious to see how they would respond. The widows greeted the visitor politely, yet with confidence, demonstrating the transformation that had occurred in just a few weeks. Samuel felt a swell of pride. These women, who had once been wary and withdrawn, now carried themselves with dignity, strength, and resilience. The rancher noticed the change as well, commenting on the energy and warmth that seemed to radiate from the property. Samuel realized that the bonds they had formed were not only healing for the widows, but had also restored a sense of vitality and purpose to himself. Evenings remained a time of reflection and connection. The widows and Samuel would sit together, sharing stories, memories, and plans for the future. They spoke of dreams once deferred, of places they had hoped to see, and of the small joys that life still offered. Samuel listened, inspired by their resilience, and found himself sharing hopes he had long kept to himself. The ranch had become a place where past and present converged, where grief was honored, and where healing could take root. The presence of the widows also taught Samuel the value of emotional courage. He learned that vulnerability was not weakness, but a bridge to deeper connection. When he shared stories of his own losses, the women responded with empathy and understanding, reinforcing the idea that sharing pain could lead to mutual support and growth. Each conversation, each shared experience, strengthened their bond and deepened their sense of family. Over time, the widows began to initiate their own projects, contributing to the ranch in ways that reflected their skills and interests. Leela, who had been quiet and hesitant, started a small flower garden near the house, planting blooms that brought color and fragrance to the property. Marissa continued weaving, creating blankets and rugs that added warmth and beauty to each room. Selena organized food storage and prepared preserves for the winter months. Each effort, while practical, carried a deeper meaning, the assertion of life, hope, and creativity in the face of past sorrow. Samuel watched these developments with a mixture of pride and humility. He had once believed that life on the ranch was defined solely by routine and self-reliance. Yet, he now understood that connection, care, and shared effort were equally vital. The widows had brought not only companionship, but also vitality, creativity, and purpose to a life that had grown quiet and solitary. Together, they had created a home where life could flourish, grief could be softened, and hope could thrive. As the sun set each evening, painting the sky in shades of orange, pink, and purple, Samuel often found himself reflecting on the journey so far. The ranch, once silent and lonely, now resonated with life, laughter, and warmth. The widows had not only found safety and healing, but had also reminded him of the richness that connection and care could bring. Samuel understood that the ranch was no longer simply a place of survival. It had become a home, a sanctuary, and a symbol of resilience and renewal. The bond between Samuel and the widows continued to grow stronger. They learned to anticipate each other's needs, to communicate without words, and to support one another in ways that transcended language. Shared meals, chores, and storytelling became rituals that reinforced trust and nurtured emotional growth. Each day, they discovered new ways to care for themselves, each other, and the land that sustained them. One evening, as the first stars appeared in the sky, the group gathered outside by the fire. The air was cool, carrying the scent of sage and earth, and the night was calm and quiet. They spoke of the journey they had shared, of the healing that had taken place, and of the hopes they carried for the future. Samuel realized that the transformation he had witnessed was profound. The ranch, once defined by isolation and sorrow, had become a place of life, connection, and joy. The widows, once strangers, had become his family, and together they had created a home filled with warmth, care, and hope. And so, the lonely rancher and the 5 Apache widows continued to heal, nurture, and grow together. The ranch, once a symbol of solitude, now embodied the strength of trust, the power of compassion, and the beauty of human connection. Samuel Hart understood at last that life's greatest richness often came not from isolation or routine, but from shared experiences, care, and the courage to open one's heart to others. The days on Samuel Hart's ranch continued to flow with a gentle rhythm, now filled with life, laughter, and shared purpose. The ranch, which had once been silent and empty, now pulsed with energy and warmth. The 5 Apache widows who had arrived in sorrow and uncertainty had become an inseparable part of Samuel's life. Each had found a place not only on the ranch but also in Samuel's heart. Together they were no longer simply coexisting, they were building a family, a home, and a future. Samuel often looked around the ranch with quiet wonder. The fences had been repaired, gardens flourished with vegetables and flowers, and animals thrived under the care of so many hands. Inside the house, the walls carried warmth and personality. Blankets and rugs woven by Marissa brightened the rooms. Shelves held jars of preserves carefully prepared by Selena, and small decorations, paintings, carvings, and little trinkets reflected the creativity and care of the women who had made the ranch their home. The transformation was astonishing, yet it had not happened through grand gestures. It had grown slowly, day by day, through shared work, mutual respect, and countless acts of kindness. One morning, Samuel rose before the sun as he always had. He stepped outside and watched the horizon glow with soft shades of gold and pink. The widows were already awake, tending the animals, gathering water and preparing breakfast. Their movements were synchronized with the rhythm of the ranch, yet each retained her individuality, her own way of doing things. Samuel felt a deep sense of pride. He realized that this home they had built together was not just a place of safety, it was a place of life, purpose, and hope. The women had grown in confidence and strength. Leela, who had been quiet and hesitant when she first arrived, now walked with her head held high, a quiet determination in her eyes. She tended to the garden, planting new vegetables and herbs, and had begun teaching Samuel a few techniques for nurturing plants. Marissa continued her weaving, filling the house with colors and warmth. Selena organized supplies, prepared meals, and helped care for the animals with patience and skill. Each woman had discovered her own way to contribute, and together, their efforts created a balance that enriched every aspect of life on the ranch. Samuel, too, had grown in ways he had never expected. He had learned to open his heart, to trust, and to share responsibility. He had discovered that strength did not only come from physical labor or solitude. It came from caring for others, from building connections, and from nurturing the growth of those around him. The ranch was no longer simply his domain. It was a shared home, a place where every life mattered and every effort contributed to the greater good. Evenings became a time for reflection and celebration. Around the fire, the group would share stories, memories, and dreams. Sometimes they sang songs from the Apache tradition, their voices blending with Samuel's deep tone to create a harmony that carried across the plains. Other times, they spoke quietly of the past, of the losses that had brought them together, and of the lessons they had learned. These conversations, simple yet profound, became a ritual, a reminder of the power of listening, empathy, and shared experience. As the weeks turned into months, the widows and Samuel began to plan for the future. They spoke of improvements to the ranch, of new crops to plant, of repairs and projects that would make life easier and more comfortable. Samuel taught the women about sustainable farming, animal care, and maintenance, while they taught him about traditional remedies, crafts, and the cultural practices that had shaped their lives. Each day was a lesson, a shared endeavor, and an opportunity to grow closer together. One afternoon, while walking through the fields, Samuel reflected on the incredible journey that had brought these women into his life. He thought of the loneliness he had once embraced, the quiet despair he had endured, and the slow, cautious steps that had led to trust and connection. The widows had not only found safety on his ranch, they had revived it, breathed life into its buildings and animals, and restored his sense of hope and purpose. He realized that life in its most profound moments was not about isolation or survival. It was about connection, care, and the courage to open one's heart to others. The widows, too, reflected on the changes in their own lives. Each had faced unimaginable loss, yet they had discovered strength, resilience, and hope. They had found a place where they could rebuild, contribute, and create beauty from the fragments of their past. They had discovered friendship, trust, and a sense of family that transcended bloodlines. The ranch was no longer just a physical space. It was a home, a sanctuary, and a testament to the power of human connection. Samuel and the widows also began to form traditions that reinforced their bond. They celebrated small milestones: the first harvest of the season, the completion of a repaired fence, a successfully tended garden patch. They marked birthdays, honored the memories of those they had lost, and shared moments of joy and gratitude. These traditions, while simple, became the threads that wove their lives together, creating a tapestry of shared experiences and enduring bonds. The ranch itself seemed to reflect the emotional growth of its inhabitants. Animals were healthier, more playful, and more affectionate. Gardens flourished with vegetables, herbs, and flowers. The house, once plain and utilitarian, now radiated warmth, color, and personality. Samuel noticed these changes not as mere coincidence, but as a reflection of the care, effort, and love invested in every corner of the property. Life, he realized, thrived wherever attention, respect, and compassion were given. Occasionally, the group faced challenges. The widow's grief sometimes returned in waves, and there were moments of disagreement or frustration. Samuel learned to navigate these situations with patience and understanding. He offered support without judgment, guidance without force, and always the reassurance that they were not alone. Each challenge became an opportunity to strengthen their bond, deepen trust, and reaffirm the shared commitment to their new life together. One evening, as the sky turned a brilliant shade of orange and pink, Samuel and the widows sat together on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The air was cool and fresh, carrying the scent of earth, sage, and distant wildflowers. They spoke of the journey that had brought them together, of the hardships they had endured, and of the hope they now shared for the future. Samuel felt a deep sense of gratitude. He had once believed his life would be defined by solitude, yet these women had shown him the profound richness of companionship, care, and shared purpose. The widows, in turn, expressed their gratitude. They had come to the ranch in sorrow and uncertainty, and they were leaving fear behind. They had found safety, support, and the freedom to rebuild their lives. Each woman had grown stronger, more confident, and more hopeful. Together, they had created not just a home, but a family. Samuel's quiet guidance, patience, and kindness had made this possible. Yet it was the women's courage, resilience, and willingness to trust that had transformed the ranch into a place of life and joy. As the seasons passed, Samuel and the widows continued to build a life full of purpose, beauty, and connection. The ranch became known in the nearby community not only for its productivity, but also for the warmth and harmony that radiated from it. Travelers passing by would occasionally stop, noticing the laughter, the well-kept fields, and the signs of life that spoke of care and dedication. The ranch was no longer isolated, forgotten, or lonely. It had become a beacon of resilience, hope, and the power of human connection. Samuel often thought about the irony of life. He had spent decades in solitude, believing that isolation was the safest, most reliable path. Yet it was the arrival of 5 strangers, grieving and vulnerable, that had brought the greatest joy, growth, and meaning to his life. He realized that life's richest experiences often came from the unexpected intersections of human lives, from the courage to open one's heart, and from the willingness to trust, care, and grow together. One crisp evening, as the stars began to twinkle above the plains, Samuel reflected on the journey of the past months. He thought of the quiet days of solitude, the hesitant first interactions with the widows, the moments of laughter, the shared work, and the emotional healing that had taken place. He recognized that the ranch, which had once been a symbol of loneliness, was now a living testament to resilience, compassion, and hope. The widows gathered around the fire, their faces glowing in the flickering light. They spoke softly, sharing hopes for the future, dreams they had once thought lost, and gratitude for the bonds they had formed. Samuel listened, feeling a profound sense of fulfillment. He understood that life was not simply about surviving or enduring. It was about building connections, nurturing growth, and creating spaces where love, care, and hope could flourish. As the night deepened, Samuel looked around at the women who had come to his ranch in tears and sorrow. They were no longer defined by loss. They were defined by courage, resilience, and the bonds they had forged together. The ranch, once quiet and lonely, now echoed with laughter, song, and the gentle rhythm of life lived fully and shared freely. Samuel realized that he had found a family, not through blood, but through shared experience, care, and trust. In the months and years that followed, Samuel and the widows continued to thrive. They maintained the ranch, expanded the gardens, cared for the animals, and nurtured their bond. They faced challenges together, celebrated successes, and created traditions that strengthened their sense of family. The ranch remained a sanctuary, a place where past sorrows were honored but did not define the present, and where hope for the future was nurtured daily. Samuel Hart, the once forgotten rancher, had discovered a profound truth. Life's greatest richness lay not in solitude, wealth, or control, but in connection, compassion, and shared purpose. The arrival of 5 grieving women had transformed his life, filling the silence with love, care, and hope. Together they had built a home, a family, and a future, proving that even in the most unexpected circumstances, human hearts could heal, flourish, and create beauty that would endure. And so the ranch continued to thrive, a living testament to resilience, trust, and the transformative power of human connection. Samuel Hart, once lonely and forgotten, now lived surrounded by love, laughter, and the strength of a family bound not by blood, but by shared courage, care, and hope for the future.